People look right through you when you take up too much space. It's the great contradiction of being heavy. You become part of the furniture. A plush, invisible armchair in the corner of the room. Until the night the city's most ruthless man bleeds out on your linoleum floor, and you're the only one who doesn't scream. That's when the invisibility wears off. And once a man like that truly sees you, there is absolutely nowhere left to hide. Sweat pooled at the small of Maeve's back, sticking her cheap polyester blouse to the cracked vinyl of her office chair. The basement archives of Rossi Imports smelled of ozone from a dying photocopier and the sour tang of week-old coffee. Nobody came down here. That was the entire point. When you tipped the scales past what society deemed acceptable, when your thighs rubbed together and your cheeks stayed permanently flushed, they put you where you couldn't offend the clientele. Upstairs, the women were all sharp angles and silk. They smelled of expensive perfume and dangerous secrets. Maeve smelled like antibacterial soap and stale paper. She pressed the heel of her hand into her right eye, trying to rub away the dull throb of a migraine. The fluorescent light overhead flickered, emitting a high-pitched buzz that burrowed straight into her skull. It was 10:30 on a Friday night. She should have been home, eating lukewarm takeout and watching television shows about people whose lives actually mattered. Instead, she was reconciling shipping manifests. A heavy thump echoed from the ceiling. Dust drifted down from the acoustic tiles, coating the screen of her outdated monitor. Maeve paused, her fingers hovering over the grease-stained keyboard. Usually, the warehouse above her was quiet after 8. Rossi Imports was a front, of course. Everyone on the payroll knew it, though nobody said it out loud. You didn't talk about the wooden crates that arrived in the dead of night, and you certainly didn't talk about Vincent Rossi. Another thump, heavier this time, followed by a muffled crack that sounded remarkably like a skull meeting concrete. Maeve's breath caught in her throat. She pushed her chair back. The wheels squeaked, a pathetic, mouse-like sound. Her heart hammered against her ribs, thick and heavy. Panic wasn't a clean, cinematic thing for her. It was clumsy. It was the tight pinch of her waistband, cutting into her stomach as she stood. It was the frantic, uncoordinated shuffle of her sensible shoes on the scuffed floor. She reached for the heavy metal flashlight she kept in her bottom drawer. The metal was cold. It grounded her. Just a little. Footsteps pounded on the metal staircase, leading down to the archives. Not the measured, arrogant strides of the men who occasionally came down to drop off boxes of redacted files. These were frantic, stumbling. The heavy fire door swung open, slamming against the cinder-block wall with a metallic clang that made Maeve flinch. Vincent Rossi stood in the doorway. He didn't look like the untouchable phantom who ran the city's underworld. He looked like a piece of meat. His charcoal suit coat was torn at the shoulder, soaked in something thick and black that looked like oil under the cheap lighting. But Maeve knew the copper tang hitting the back of her throat wasn't oil. It was blood. He leaned against the doorframe, chest heaving. His breathing was a wet, ragged rasp. His dark eyes, usually dead and unreadable, were blown wide with shock. He looked at her. Really looked at her. Not past her. Not through her. "Lock it," he choked out. The words bubbled up through blood. He collapsed forward, hitting the linoleum with a sickening slap. Maeve didn't scream. Screaming drew attention, and her entire existence was built on avoiding it. Her hands shook violently, dropping the flashlight. It rolled across the floor, the beam illuminating the spreading pool of dark red beneath Vincent's torso. She stood frozen for 3 agonizing seconds. Her mind fractured into 2 distinct voices. One screamed at her to run out the back exit, to disappear into the rain-slicked alley and never look back. The other, the cynical survivor that had kept her alive in a world that mocked her very existence, knew that if she ran, whoever was up there would eventually find her. She was a loose end, and the Mafia didn't do loose ends. She lunged for the door. Her thigh caught the edge of her metal desk, leaving an immediate, blooming bruise. But she ignored the pain. She slammed the heavy fire door shut and threw the deadbolt. Her fingers slipped on the latch, slick with her own cold sweat. Silence descended on the room, broken only by the wet, gurgling sound of Vincent Rossi drowning in his own blood. She turned around. He was a monster. She knew exactly what he was. She had seen the discrepancies in the ledgers. She knew the blood money that paid her meager salary. She should let him die. The world would be objectively better. But as she watched his hand twitch, smearing a red arc across the cheap floor wax, a bizarre, entirely selfish thought crossed her mind. If he dies here, I have to clean it up. She dropped to her knees. The impact jarred her spine. Up close, he smelled of expensive tobacco, gunpowder, and raw meat. "Hey," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Hey, don't die. You can't die here." Vincent's eyelids fluttered. He groaned, a guttural sound of pure agony. His hand shot out, grasping her wrist with terrifying strength. His fingers dug into her flesh, finding the bone beneath the soft padding of her arm. "Don't," he wheezed. "Don't call anyone." "I'm not," she breathed. She looked at his shoulder, then down at his side. A dark stain was spreading rapidly across his white dress shirt, just above the hip. Maeve didn't know first aid, but she knew pressure. She grabbed the oversized cardigan she kept on her chair for drafts, balled it up, and pressed it hard against the wound on his side. Vincent arched his back, a hiss of pain escaping his clenched teeth. His grip on her wrist tightened until she felt her fingers go numb. "Keep breathing," she ordered, surprised by the sudden, flat authority in her own voice. "Just keep breathing, Mr. Rossi." He stared up at her. The harsh light cast deep, bruised shadows under his eyes. "Who?" He swallowed hard. "Who are you?" It figured. She had worked in his building for 3 years. "I'm the invisible woman," Maeve muttered, pressing her entire body weight into her hands. "Now shut up and bleed quietly." Time lost its shape. It became measured only by the agonizingly slow seep of blood saturating Maeve's grey cardigan. Above them, heavy footsteps echoed through the warehouse, the muffled shouts of men tearing the place apart looking for a corpse. Vincent's breathing had grown shallower. His skin, usually a tanned olive tone, had turned the color of wet cement. The grip on her wrist had slackened, his hand falling limply to the floor. "Stay with me," Maeve whispered fiercely. She wasn't doing this out of compassion. She was doing it out of terror. If the men upstairs found him dead, they would kill her. If they found him alive, they would kill her. Her only play was to keep him breathing until they left. She needed to secure the wound. Her arms were burning, muscles screaming in protest from the awkward angle and sustained pressure. She looked frantically around her cluttered desk. Paper clips, a stapler, a roll of heavy-duty packing tape. "I have to move my hands," she told him. His eyes were half closed, but they tracked her movement. "It's going to hurt." He gave a barely perceptible nod. Maeve snatched the packing tape. She ripped off a long strip with her teeth, the plastic cutting the corner of her lip. She tasted her own blood, a sharp contrast to the overwhelming copper stench of his. "Lift up," she ordered. Vincent tried. He grunted, his abdominal muscles seizing, but he couldn't get his torso off the ground. "Damn it!" Maeve hissed. She didn't think about propriety. She didn't think about the fact that this man killed people for a living. She just acted. She shoved her arm under his back, her knuckles scraping against the gritty floor. He was dead weight. solid muscle and heavy bones. She strained, her face turning crimson, a pathetic wheeze escaping her lips as she hoisted him up just enough to slide the tape under him. She wrapped it tight over the bloody cardigan, binding it to his waist. Once, twice, 3 times. The adhesive bit into his skin and his shredded shirt. It was a butcher's job, ugly and desperate. When she finally let him drop back against the floor, she slumped against the metal desk, gasping for air. Her blouse was ruined. Her hands were stained crimson up to the wrists. She looked like a murderer. Above them, the footsteps paused directly over the basement trapdoor. Maeve stopped breathing. She squeezed her eyes shut. "Don't look down. Don't look down." A muffled voice drifted through the floorboards. "Check the loading dock. He wouldn't go to the basement. It's a dead end." Footsteps receded. A heavy metal door slammed in the distance. Then, nothing but the humming of the fluorescent lights. Maeve let out a long, shuddering breath. Her body began to tremble, a violent, uncontrollable shaking that rattled her teeth. She pulled her knees to her chest, trying to make herself as small as possible. A futile effort. "You're shaking." The voice was barely a whisper, rough like sandpaper. Maeve opened her eyes. Vincent was watching her. The bleeding seemed to have slowed, contained by the tight wrap of tape and wool. "I'm terrified," she admitted bluntly. There was no point in lying. "You bled all over my floor. They're going to come back." "They won't," Vincent rasped. He tried to push himself up on his good elbow, failing and collapsing back with a grimace. "Carmine. He thinks I'm dead. He'll want to take the territory fast. Won't waste time checking a basement." Carmine, the underboss, the slick, smiling man who always looked at Maeve with naked disgust whenever he was forced to interact with her. "Carmine did this?" she asked. Vincent's lips curled into a weak, bloody sneer. "Surprised?" "No," Maeve said. "His margins on the port shipments have been off for 6 months. He's been skimming. I figured he'd have to make a move before you noticed." Vincent went completely still. The pain in his eyes was momentarily eclipsed by a sharp, piercing intelligence. It was the look of a predator, spotting movement in the tall grass. "You," he coughed, a wet sound. "You know about the margins?" Maeve felt a flush of heat rise in her cheeks. Not out of embarrassment, but defensiveness. "I reconcile the books, Mr. Rossi. I do the data entry. You people give me the doctored ledgers and the real ones, and you assume I'm too stupid to compare them because I'm just the fat girl in the basement." It was a reckless thing to say to a mafia boss. The adrenaline was making her stupid. Vincent didn't look angry. He looked fascinated. "What's your name?" he asked again. "Maeve." "Maeve." He tested the syllables on his tongue. "You didn't scream, Maeve. Why?" "Because nobody comes to save the fat girl," she said, the words bitter and true, tasting like ashes in her mouth. "You learn to deal with the messes yourself." He held her gaze for a long moment. There was no pity in his eyes, only calculation. "I need to get out of here," he said softly. "Carmine owns the private doctors. He owns the cops on this beat. If I go to a hospital, I'm dead on arrival." Maeve stared at him. "What do you want me to do? I wrapped you in packing tape. I'm not a surgeon." "You have a car." "A rusty sedan. Take me to your place." The sheer audacity of the request left her temporarily mute. "Are you insane?" "No, absolutely not. If Carmine finds out you were in the building tonight, he'll kill you just to be thorough," Vincent interrupted. His voice was gaining a fraction of its usual gravelly strength. "You know about the skim. You're a liability. You help me, I protect you. You leave me here, we're both dead." It wasn't a threat. It was a simple statement of fact. Maeve looked at the bloody floor. She looked at her blood-stained hands. She was already in it. The quiet, invisible life she had built to protect herself was gone, shattered the moment he walked through that door. She swallowed the bile rising in her throat. "Fine," she said, her voice trembling. "But if you bleed on my upholstery, I'm leaving you in a ditch." A ghost of a smirk touched Vincent's pale lips. Understood. The drive to her apartment was a blur of neon streetlights smearing across the rain-streaked windshield. Maeve drove with both hands, gripping the steering wheel so hard her knuckles ached. Every time a car pulled up behind them, her stomach dropped to her toes. Vincent rode in the passenger seat, slumped against the window. He had insisted on walking out to the car under his own power, leaning heavily on her shoulder. The smell of him, sweat, blood, and the metallic scent of adrenaline, filled the cramped cabin of her old sedan. Her apartment was on the third floor of a walk-up in a neighborhood that hadn't seen gentrification and never would. It smelled of cheap laundry detergent and boiling cabbage from the neighbors down the hall. Getting him up the stairs was an exercise in pure agony. Maeve took most of his weight. Her calves burned, her breath coming in harsh, embarrassing wheezes. She hated that he could feel how soft she was, hated the way her body betrayed her lack of stamina. But Vincent didn't complain. He just kept moving, his jaw locked in a rictus of pain. When they finally made it inside, she guided him to her worn, floral-patterned sofa. He collapsed onto it, groaning as the cushions swallowed him. Maeve locked the deadbolt, threw the chain, and stood by the door, chest heaving. Her apartment was small, cluttered. Stacks of paperback thrillers, half-finished knitting projects, and mismatched mugs. It was a cozy, pathetic little sanctuary. And now the devil himself was bleeding on her throw pillows. "I need alcohol," Vincent mumbled, eyes closed. "Rubbing alcohol, or vodka, and needle and thread. Silk, if you have it." "I don't have silk thread. I'm not a seamstress," she snapped, her nerves finally fraying. She marched into the tiny bathroom and raided her medicine cabinet. She came back with a bottle of isopropyl alcohol, a cheap sewing kit, and a handful of gauze pads. She stood over him, clutching the supplies. "I'm not doing this. I can't stitch a person." Vincent opened his eyes. The black pits of his pupils were blown wide. "You want me to do it?" "You can barely lift your arm. Then you have to." He reached out with his uninjured arm and grabbed her wrist again. Gently this time. His thumb brushed over the frantic pulse, jumping beneath her skin. "Look at me, Maeve." She didn't want to. She wanted to look at the floor. But the quiet command in his voice pulled her gaze up. "You patched me up with tape. You got me past 3 patrol cars without panicking. You can do this. Why me?" The words slipped out before she could stop them. A lifetime of insecurity bubbling to the surface. You have hundreds of people working for you. Beautiful women. Dangerous men. "Why trust me?" "Because beautiful women are paid to smile, and dangerous men are paid to lie," Vincent said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "You hate me. I can see it in your eyes. But you're smart. You survived tonight because you're a pragmatist. I don't need loyalty right now, Maeve. I need someone who wants to live." It was a terrible, ugly truth. And it was exactly what she needed to hear. She didn't want pretty lies. She wanted survival. She set the supplies on the coffee table. "Take your shirt off, or what's left of it." She helped him peel the ruined fabric away from his skin. The tape was a nightmare to remove, ripping away hair and flesh. Vincent bit down on the sleeve of his coat, a muffled groan escaping his lips. But he didn't pull away. The wound was ugly. A jagged tear along his ribs where a bullet had grazed him, and a deeper puncture near his collarbone from what looked like a knife. "This is going to burn," she warned, unscrewing the cap on the alcohol. "Do it." She poured it directly over the wounds. Vincent's entire body went rigid. His muscles jumped beneath his skin, cords of tension standing out on his neck. But he didn't scream. Maeve threaded the needle with shaking hands. The smell of the alcohol cut through the smell of blood, stinging her nose. "Talk to me," she said, her voice wavering as she pierced the first layer of skin on his ribs. "Distract me. Tell me about the skimming." Vincent let out a long, shaky exhale. "Carmine has been routing shipments through an independent dock down in Red Hook, bypassing my checkers." Maeve pulled the thread tight. Vincent flinched. "I know," she said, keeping her eyes focused on the bloody work. "He's been using a shell company called Orion Logistics. The invoices show up in the secondary ledger every third Tuesday." Vincent opened his eyes, staring at the ceiling. The ticking of the radiator was the only sound in the room for a long moment. "You put that together just from the data entry?" he asked. "It wasn't hard," Maeve muttered, tying off a messy knot and moving to the collarbone. "He used his mistress's maiden name for the shell company's registered agent. Idiotic." A low rumble started in Vincent's chest. It took Maeve a second to realize it was a laugh, a dark, painful chuckle. "Idiotic," Vincent agreed. "I pay a team of forensic accountants 6 figures a year, and the girl in the basement figures it out because the underboss is thinking with his dick." "Don't laugh. You're making the skin move," she scolded, wiping away a fresh bead of blood. She worked in silence for 20 minutes. The stitches were crude, Frankenstein-like track marks across his pale skin. But they held. The bleeding stopped. She taped gauze over the wounds, her hands lingering for a fraction of a second on the hard plane of his chest. He was warm, alive, and he was looking at her with an expression she had never seen directed at her before. Not disgust, not pity, not dismissal. Intense, focused curiosity. "You're wasted in the basement, Maeve," he said softly. Maeve stood up quickly, grabbing the bloody towels and the empty alcohol bottle. She felt her face flush, angry at herself for the sudden flutter in her chest. "Don't patronize me," she snapped, turning her back to him. "I'm just a bookkeeper. I'll make you some tea. Then you're going to sleep on that couch, and tomorrow you're going to figure out how to leave without getting me killed." She practically fled to the tiny kitchen. She leaned against the laminate counter, gripping the edge until her knuckles turned white. In the living room, Vincent watched her go. The pain was a dull roar in his body, but his mind was crystal clear for the first time in weeks. Carmine had the men. Carmine had the guns. But Vincent had Maeve. And looking at the way she had stitched him back together, messy and furious and brutally efficient, he realized something. He didn't just need a place to hide. He needed a weapon Carmine would never see coming. "Make it black!" Vincent called out, his voice scraping through the quiet apartment. "And Maeve?" She paused, looking over her shoulder from the kitchen doorway. "You're not invisible anymore." A shiver traced its way down her spine. The words weren't a comfort. They were a life sentence. Morning arrived not with sunlight, but with the violent rattle of a garbage truck grinding its gears in the alleyway. Maeve woke up with a sharp crick in her neck. She was slumped in her beat-up thrift store armchair, a thin crocheted blanket pooled at her waist. Her mouth tasted like copper and sleep. For 3 blissful seconds, she forgot. Then she saw the bloody scissors on the coffee table. She snapped her head toward the sofa. Vincent was exactly where she had left him. He lay flat on his back, one arm draped over his stomach, his breathing a shallow, rhythmic hiss. His skin was the color of old parchment, damp with a sheen of fever sweat. The sheer size of him dwarfed her furniture. His boots hung over the armrest, tracking dried mud onto the floral fabric. Maeve stood, her knees popping loudly in the quiet room. Her body ached in places she hadn't known could hold tension. She padded into the kitchen and turned on the tap, letting the water run cold before splashing it over her face. She looked in the mirror above the sink. Dark circles hung under her eyes like bruised plums. Her brown hair, usually wrestled into a severe bun, hung in limp, greasy strands around her cheeks. She looked exactly like a woman who had spent the night patching up a mobster with packing tape and cheap vodka. You stare at yourself like you're a disappointment. Maeve jumped, splashing water onto her worn pajama top. She spun around. Vincent was awake. His dark eyes were fixed on her from the living room, heavy-lidded but startlingly sharp. He hadn't moved an inch, but the predatory stillness was back. I stare at myself like someone who wants to survive until Tuesday, Maeve retorted, grabbing a rough dish towel to dry her face. You have a fever. Expected, he murmured. He shifted slightly, a sharp intake of breath hissing through his teeth. What time is it? 7:30. Maeve walked back into the living room, keeping a safe distance. I have to go to work. You do. She blinked. You want me to just leave you here, bleeding on my couch? If you don't show up to the basement today, Carmine will send someone to your apartment by noon, Vincent said. His voice lacked its usual baritone rumble, scraping out of his throat like dry leaves. He knows I was in the building. He knows someone cleaned up the blood. If the invisible girl suddenly goes missing, she becomes a very visible loose end. He was right. God, she hated that he was right. What am I supposed to do? She asked, the panic returning, thick and suffocating. Just sit at my desk and pretend I didn't sew your chest shut last night? Exactly that. Vincent turned his head, his gaze pinning her. Carmine is going to call a meeting. He'll act somber. He'll say I'm missing, presumed dead from a rival hit. Watch his hands. Watch who stands closest to him. That's his inner circle. Those are the men we have to kill. We. The pronoun dropped into the room like a live grenade. There is no we, Maeve said, her voice shaking. I saved your life because I didn't want to get shot by your underboss. That's the end of the transaction. I am a bookkeeper. You're a woman harboring a dead man, Vincent corrected softly. That makes you an accomplice. Carmine won't care about your job title when he finds my blood under your fingernails. Maeve looked down at her hands. He was right. A faint, rusty stain lingered in the cuticles of her right index finger, impervious to the cheap soap she'd scrubbed with last night. I need antibiotics, Vincent continued, his eyes drifting closed again. Broad spectrum. Fish mox, if you have to go to a pet store. Amoxicillin. I don't care. And I need a burner phone. You can't buy them near here. Go 3 neighborhoods over. He was giving orders. Bleeding on her clearance rack pillows, and he was giving orders. I'll see what I can do, Maeve muttered, turning toward her bedroom to find clothes that didn't smell like terror. Maeve. She stopped in the doorway. Don't look down when you walk into the building today, he said. People like Carmine smell fear. If you act like prey, they'll bare their teeth. Look bored. You're a miserable employee who hates her Friday night shifts. Sell it. She didn't answer. She just closed the bedroom door, leaning her heavy back against the cheap hollow core wood, and tried to remember how to breathe. Bleach. It was the first thing to hit her when she walked through the heavy glass doors of Rossi Imports. Not the subtle, soapy clean of a regular janitorial crew. This was industrial-grade, eye-watering ammonia and bleach. They had scrubbed the building. Maeve swiped her keycard. The light blinked green. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. but she kept her face carefully slack. "Look bored. Sell it." The lobby was crawling with men in cheap suits who tried to act like they weren't carrying concealed weapons. Dominic, a thick-necked enforcer who usually guarded the loading docks, was standing by the reception desk. He watched her waddle slightly in her sensible orthotics, a look of mild distaste crossing his face before he looked away. Perfect. Disgust was safe. Disgust meant she was exactly what they expected. She took the elevator down to the basement. When the doors opened, the smell of bleach was so thick she actually gagged. The floor of her archive room was shining, stripped of its protective wax layer in a furious effort to remove Vincent Rossi's bloodstains. Maeve walked to her desk. She dropped her oversized purse onto the metal surface, pulled out her chair, and sat down. The squeak of the wheels sounded impossibly loud in the empty room. Her monitor flickered to life. For the next 3 hours, she entered customs declarations for imported olive oil. Her fingers flew across the 10-key pad, muscle memory taking over while her brain spiraled. Every time the heavy metal door upstairs groaned, her stomach dropped. At 11 o'clock, the intercom on her desk buzzed. It was a harsh, jarring sound that made her jump an inch out of her chair. All staff, main warehouse floor. Now, it wasn't the receptionist's voice. It was Carmine's. Maeve pushed herself up, her thighs rubbing together uncomfortably under her heavy wool skirt. She joined the trickle of mid-level management and dock workers heading to the vast, concrete-floored warehouse at the back of the building. The air was thick with tension. 50 people stood in a loose semicircle. At the front, standing on a wooden pallet of imported ceramics, was Carmine. He was a handsome man, in a slick, predatory way. Pomaded hair, custom-tailored suit that hugged his lean frame. But today, the smile was gone. He looked appropriately grim. Maeve hung near the back, behind a towering stack of cardboard boxes. She made herself small. "I have bad news," Carmine projected, his voice bouncing off the corrugated metal ceiling. "Last night, Mr. Rossi's car was found abandoned near the harbor. There was an altercation." He paused, letting the silence stretch for dramatic effect. "We believe the Calabrese family made a move. Until we have confirmation, Mr. Rossi is presumed dead." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some feigned shock. Others looked nervously at their shoes. "Effective immediately, I am stepping in to handle operations," Carmine continued, his voice hardening, losing the fake sorrow. "Nothing stops. We double the security on the docks. Anyone asks, we are grieving. But we are strong. We find who did this, and we gut them." Maeve watched his hands, just like Vincent had said. Carmine was rubbing his right thumb over his index finger, a nervous tick. He was lying, and he was terrified someone was going to call his bluff. She looked at the men flanking him. Dominic was there, and Leo, the head of collections, a man with dead eyes and a jagged scar across his chin. They stood close to the pallet, the inner circle, the mutineers. "Dismissed!" Carmine barked. The crowd began to disperse. Maeve turned to head back to her basement, but a voice stopped her. "Hey, bookkeeper!" She froze. The blood drained from her face, leaving her feeling dizzy and sick. She slowly turned around. Carmine had hopped down from the pallet and was walking toward her. Up close, he smelled of expensive cologne and stale cigarette smoke. He looked her up and down, his eyes lingering on her broad hips and rumpled blouse with poorly concealed contempt. "You were here late last night," Carmine stated. It wasn't a question. Maeve forced herself to look at his chin, avoiding eye contact. Submissive, unthreatening. "Yes, Mr. Carmine. Month-end reconciliations. I left around 10. You see anything? Hear anything?" He leaned in slightly, invading her personal space. Maeve let out a nervous, stuttering breath, leaning back. She channeled every ounce of genuine anxiety pulsing through her veins into her performance. No, sir. I was down in the archives. The servers are very loud. I did my work and took the bus home. Carmine stared at her for a long, agonizing moment. He was looking for a crack. But looking at Maeve, all he saw was a sweaty, nervous, overweight woman who was terrified of her own shadow. He scoffed, a short, ugly sound. Right, go back to your numbers. He turned away, dismissing her entirely. Maeve didn't run. She walked at a measured, slightly clumsy pace back to the stairwell. Only when the heavy metal fire door clicked shut behind her did she allow herself to collapse against the cinder-block wall. Her legs gave out, and slid down to the cold floor, gasping for air as black spots danced in her vision. She had survived the morning, but survival wasn't going to be enough. Vincent needed leverage, and she was the only one who could get it. She pushed herself back up. Instead of going to her desk, she walked to the far corner of the archives, where the server rack hummed loudly. Carmine thought she was just a data entry clerk. He didn't realize that when you make someone invisible, you also make them undetectable. She plugged a small black USB drive into the master terminal. She didn't need high-tech hacking skills. She just needed the administrative passwords, which the IT guy had taped to the bottom of his keyboard 3 years ago. She began downloading the secondary ledgers, the real ones, the proof of Carmine's theft. The rain started again on her walk home from the pet store, soaking through her cheap trench coat and plastering her hair to her skull. She carried a plastic bag containing a bottle of fish amoxicillin, gauze, surgical tape, and a prepaid burner phone she'd bought at a bodega 2 miles away. When she unlocked her apartment door, the smell hit her first. The coppery tang of blood had been replaced by the sour, sharp scent of infection and fever sweat. Vincent was sitting up. He had dragged himself from the couch to her small kitchen table. He was shirtless, the crude stitches Maeve had sewn looking angry and red against his pale skin. He held her grandmother's heavy cast-iron skillet in his uninjured hand, his knuckles white. When the door clicked shut, he slowly lowered the pan. "You brought a frying pan to a gunfight?" Maeve asked, her voice cracking as she dropped her wet bag onto the counter. "I work with what I have," Vincent rasped. He dropped the skillet onto the laminate with a heavy thud. He looked terrible. His eyes were glassy, sunken deep into his skull. Maeve pulled the fish antibiotics from the bag. "2 of these. Now." She shoved a glass of water toward him. "I know it says for aquariums, but the pharmacist on a Reddit thread swore it's the same chemical compound." Vincent didn't argue. He swallowed the large capsules dry, chasing them with a mouthful of water. He coughed, wincing as the movement pulled at his stitches. "You get the phone?" he asked. Maeve tossed the cheap plastic brick onto the table. "Yes. And I went to work." Carmine put on a show. "Claimed the Calabrese family took you out. He's taking over operations." Who was standing next to him? Dominic. Leo. Maeve pulled out a chair opposite him and sat heavily. Her feet throbbed. They looked comfortable. Too comfortable for men whose boss just died. Vincent nodded slowly, his mind turning over the information, despite the fever burning through him. "Leo handles the money. Dominic handles the muscle. Carmine needs them both to keep the captains from rebelling." Maeve reached into the deep pocket of her wet coat. She pulled out the black USB drive and set it on the table between them. It landed with a soft clack. Vincent stared at it. "What is that?" "The shadow ledgers," Maeve said, her voice dropping into a flat, professional cadence. "Every discrepancy from the Red Hook docks for the last 8 months. account numbers, routing paths, shell company registrations. I downloaded everything from the main server before I left. Vincent looked from the flash drive to Maeve. The glassiness in his eyes vanished, replaced by a sharp, burning intensity. He didn't reach for the drive. He just looked at her, truly absorbing the woman sitting across from him. Her hair was a wet, frizzy mess. Her clothes were cheap and damp. She didn't possess an ounce of the sleek, weaponized glamour of the women in his world. Yet, she had just handed him the key to tearing Carmine apart, and she had done it right under the bastard's nose. "You stole from the family servers," Vincent said softly. "If they catch you, they won't just kill you, Maeve. They'll peel you." "They won't catch me," she said, her chin lifting defiantly. "Because I logged in using the credentials of the head of IT. If they trace the download, they'll think Carmine's own guy is betraying him." A heavy silence stretched between them, broken only by the steady drumming of rain against the window pane. "You're a terrifying woman, Maeve," Vincent murmured. It wasn't an insult. Coming from him, it sounded like the highest form of praise. Maeve felt a treacherous flush of warmth creep up her neck, but she forced her expression to remain hard. She leaned forward, crossing her arms over her chest. "We need to talk about terms," she said. Vincent raised an eyebrow. "Terms? I am risking my life," she stated, the tremor in her voice completely gone now. Fear had crystallized into pure, cynical pragmatism. "I stitched you up. I lied to a murderer. I stole encrypted data. I am no longer just an innocent bystander. So, if we are doing this, we do it on my terms." Vincent leaned back slightly, a ghost of a smile pulling at his cracked lips. "I'm listening. First, when this is over, and you get your empire back, I want out. I want a severance package big enough to disappear to a state where nobody knows my name, and I want a clean background." "Done," Vincent said instantly. "What else?" "Second," Maeve pointed a stubby, unmanicured finger at him. "Stop treating me like a pawn. You don't give me half-truths. If you're going to use my brain to win a war, you tell me the whole plan. I won't be caught off guard because you decided a civilian didn't need to know the details." Vincent's gaze dropped to the table, then slowly rose back to meet hers. The sheer proximity of him across the small table made the air feel thin. He smelled like danger and sickness, an intoxicating, confusing combination that made Maeve's heart beat a little too fast. "You aren't a civilian anymore, Maeve," he said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that settled in her stomach. "You're the only soldier I have left. You want the whole truth?" She swallowed hard, nodding once. "Yes, Carmine won't just take the business. He's going to clean house. Anyone loyal to me is going to have an accident over the next 48 hours, Vincent said, leaning over the table, bridging the gap between them. "I need to contact 3 men in the city who I know aren't bought. I need to arrange a meeting, and I need you to be the one to deliver the message." Maeve's breath hitched. "Me? I can't just walk up to mafia captains. They'll laugh in my face or shoot me." "They won't laugh." Vincent reached out, his hot, feverish fingers closing over her wrist, resting directly over her pulse. "You are going to take my signet ring. You are going to tell them the ghost of Vincent Rossi is calling a parley. And if they doubt you, you show them the drive." His thumb stroked the sensitive skin of her inner wrist, an unconscious, grounding gesture that sent a jolt of electricity straight up her arm. She tried to pull away, but his grip, though weak, was absolute. "You said nobody comes to save the fat girl," Vincent whispered, his dark eyes locked onto hers, stripping away every layer of armor she had spent 30 years building. "You're right. You save yourself. Tomorrow, you go on the offensive. Heavy gold felt different than cheap brass. It sat at the bottom of Maeve's trench coat pocket, a dense, anchoring weight against her thigh. Vincent's signet ring. She stood outside a butcher shop in the meatpacking district. The air smelled of sawdust, raw beef, and the sharp tang of impending snow. Inside, behind the glass case displaying pale veal and thick-cut ribeyes, stood Frank Russo. Frank was a captain who controlled the transportation unions. He was also a man who had famously broken an informant's jaw with a frozen ham hock. Maeve's hands were shaking so violently she had to bury them deep in her pockets. Adrenaline was a toxic sludge in her veins. Her sensible shoes pinched her swollen toes, and the cheap fabric of her coat trapped her nervous sweat, making her feel clammy and disgusting. "Look bored," Vincent had said. "Sell it." She pushed the glass door open. The bell above chimed cheerfully, a sick contrast to the thumping in her ears. Frank looked up from wiping down his slicer. He was a barrel-chested man with a nose that had been broken too many times to sit straight. His eyes flicked over her, categorizing and dismissing her in a fraction of a second. A civilian, a nobody, a woman who ate too many pastries. "We're closed, lady," Frank grunted, turning his back. "I need 2 pounds of ghost meat," Maeve said. Her voice cracked on the final word, sounding pathetic. She cleared her throat, swallowed the sour taste of bile, and tried again. 2 pounds of ghost meat." Frank froze. The rag in his hand stopped moving. Slowly, he turned around. The casual dismissal was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating menace. He wiped his hands on his blood-stained apron, walked around the counter, and locked the front door. He pulled down the plastic shades. "Who sent you?" he asked. Maeve pulled her trembling hand out of her pocket. She didn't hand him the ring. She let it drop onto the glass display case. It hit the surface with a heavy, final clack. Frank stared at the crest. A stylized wolf biting a sword. Vincent's personal seal. "He's dead," Frank said flatly. "Carmine told us this morning." "Carmine is a liar," Maeve replied. She forced herself to maintain eye contact, even though every instinct screamed at her to look at the floor. Carmine took a shot at him, missed the vitals, and is currently trying to consolidate power before the body is even cold. Frank let out a harsh, barking laugh. "And Vincent sent a secretary to tell me this? A broad who looks like she gets winded walking up a flight of stairs?" The insult stung, a hot needle right into her oldest insecurities. For a second, Maeve wanted to shrink, to apologize, to run away. But then she remembered the smell of Vincent's blood on her hands. She remembered Carmine's mocking sneer. She planted her feet. She stopped trying to make her large body small. "I'm the woman who kept him breathing, while your people let a traitor shoot him in his own warehouse," Maeve snapped, her voice dropping an octave, ringing with genuine, exhausted anger. "I'm the woman who stole the shadow ledgers proving Carmine has been skimming from the Red Hook docks for 8 months. And I'm the woman telling you that if you back Carmine tonight, you're backing a dead man." She reached into her other pocket, pulled out a folded piece of paper, and slammed it onto the glass next to the ring. It was a printout of the Shell Company accounts. Frank picked up the paper. His eyes scanned the numbers. His jaw tightened, a muscle ticking violently under his cheek. "Where is he?" Frank asked, his voice a low growl. "Safe," Maeve lied. He was currently bleeding on her cheap sofa, hallucinating from a fever. "He wants a parley, tonight. The old train yard in Queens. Bring Arthur and Thomas. Nobody else." She snatched the ring off the glass and shoved it back into her pocket. She didn't wait for his answer. She turned and walked out, her legs feeling like lead. She made it exactly 2 blocks before ducking into a trash-filled alley and throwing up her meager breakfast. She leaned against the cold brick wall, wiping her mouth with the back of her trembling hand, gasping for air. 1 down. 2 to go. Dusk settled over the city, painting the cramped walls of Maeve's apartment in shades of bruised purple and charcoal. The radiator hissed, fighting a losing battle against the damp chill seeping through the single-pane windows. Maeve sat on the edge of the coffee table, a damp washcloth in her hand. Vincent was burning up. The fish antibiotics hadn't fully kicked in yet. He was thrashing weakly against the cushions, his skin slick with sweat, muttering things in rapid, guttural Italian. Maeve pressed the cool cloth to his forehead, holding it there firmly until he stopped moving. "Quiet," she murmured, an involuntary gentleness in her voice. "You're going to rip your stitches." His dark eyes snapped open. They were unfocused for a terrifying second before clarity pierced through the fever haze. He looked at her hand on his forehead, then up at her face. "Did you do it?" he rasped. "Frank, Arthur and Thomas. They'll be at the train yard at midnight." Maeve pulled the cloth away, wringing it out in a bowl of cold water on the floor. "Arthur almost shot me, but Thomas talked him down. They saw the ledgers. They know Carmine is stealing from the family pot, not just you." Vincent let out a long, ragged exhale. The tension draining from his muscles was visible. He reached up, his large, calloused hand wrapping around her wrist, stopping her from returning the washcloth to his brow. "You did good, Maeve," he said quietly. "I threw up in an alleyway and cried on the subway," she admitted, the raw truth slipping out. She was too tired to build walls. "I am not built for this, Vincent. Nobody is built for this," he corrected, his thumb tracing the blue vein on the inside of her wrist. "Some people just learn to hide the shaking better. You walked into the dens of 3 killers today, and you commanded the room. You saved our lives." He didn't say my life. He said our lives. The small apartment suddenly felt entirely too intimate. The smell of his sweat, the heat radiating off his skin, the heavy, undeniable pull of his gaze. Maeve felt a flush that had nothing to do with embarrassment rise in her chest. She had spent her entire adult life trying to be unnoticeable. To have the most dangerous man in the city look at her with absolute, unwavering focus was intoxicating and terrifying. "What happens at midnight?" she asked, desperately steering the conversation back to survival. Vincent let go of her wrist, though the ghost of his touch lingered on her skin. He pushed himself up into a sitting position, stifling a groan. "At midnight, Carmine thinks he's meeting the captains to formalize his takeover," Vincent said, his voice hardening into the cold, flat tone of an executioner. "He thinks he has the muscle, but the muscle is loyal to the money, and Carmine's been stealing the money." "And you?" she asked. "You can barely stand." "I don't need to fight him. I just need to be there to look him in the eye when his men realize they're backing a thief." Vincent looked at the cheap wall clock ticking above the stove. "I need my gun. And I need my coat." Maeve stood up. "I'm going with you." Vincent stopped dead. "Absolutely not. Your job is done. You stay here, you lock the door, and you wait." "No." The word slipped out before she even realized she was going to say it. Vincent's brow furrowed. "Maeve, it's a shootout. It's not a data entry error. You will get killed. If Carmine wins tonight, he sends men here anyway. I'm a loose end," she argued, crossing her arms over her chest. "Besides, you're running a fever of 102. You can't even drive." They stared at each other, an unspoken battle of wills filling the tiny room. Vincent was used to absolute obedience. Maeve was used to giving it. but the rules had fractured the moment he bled on her linoleum. Vincent broke first. A dark, cynical amusement danced in his eyes. "Fine," he grunted, reaching for the torn, bloody shirt resting on a nearby chair. "But if shooting starts, you get behind me and you stay on the ground. Do you understand?" "Loud and clear," she said, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Midnight in the abandoned Queen's train yard smelled of rust, standing water, and diesel fuel. The skeleton of a rusted-out freight car loomed in the darkness, casting long, jagged shadows across the gravel under the pale light of a half-moon. Maeve sat behind the steering wheel of her beat-up sedan, parked in the deep shadows behind a concrete pylon 50 yards away. The engine was off. The cold crept through the floorboards, biting at her ankles. Vincent was gone. He had slipped out into the darkness 5 minutes ago, moving with a silent, limping grace that defied the brutal stitches holding his side together. Through the cracked windshield, Maeve watched the scene unfold like a silent movie. 3 black SUVs were parked in a triangle, their headlights illuminating the center of the gravel lot. Carmine stood in the light. He looked immaculate in a dark overcoat, flanked by Dominic and Leo. Their hands rested casually inside their jackets. Muscle. Opposite them stood Frank, Arthur, and Thomas. They looked grim. Frank was smoking a cigar, the cherry glowing angry red in the cold air. Maeve couldn't hear the words, but she could see the posturing. Carmine's expansive hand gestures, the slick, arrogant tilt of his head. He was giving a speech. He was selling them the future. Then, the script flipped. From the shadows behind the captains, a figure emerged. Vincent Rossi walked into the headlights. Even from 50 yards away, Maeve saw the exact moment Carmine's soul left his body. The underboss staggered backward, his pristine leather shoes slipping on the loose gravel. Leo and Dominic flinched, instinctively reaching for their weapons, but they froze. Vincent didn't draw his gun. He simply stood there, his coat billowing slightly in the biting wind. He was pale, leaning heavily on his right leg, but the aura of absolute, terrifying authority he projected filled the entire yard. Frank took a step to the side, distancing himself from Carmine. Arthur and Thomas mirrored the movement. Carmine was shouting now. Maeve rolled her window down an inch. "He's weak!" Carmine's voice cracked, echoing off the concrete. "Look at him! He's a dead man walking! Shoot him, Dominic!" Dominic hesitated, looking from Carmine to Vincent. Vincent finally spoke. His voice didn't yell. It didn't need to. It carried the dense weight of inevitability. "You stole 3 million from the Red Hook container ships, Carmine," Vincent said. "Money that belonged to the families. Money that belonged to these men." Carmine spun on the captains, panic replacing the slick veneer. "He's lying! It's a bluff! He doesn't have proof!" Maeve's hands hovered over the cheap burner phone resting in her lap. This was the signal. Vincent looked straight at the concrete pylon hiding her car. He gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod. Maeve hit send. Every phone in the pocket of every captain, enforcer, and driver in that yard buzzed simultaneously. The mass text contained the screenshots of the shadow ledgers, the account numbers, and the undeniable paper trail proving Carmine had gutted their pensions. The silence that followed was suffocating. Leo pulled his phone out. He stared at the screen. Slowly, the dead-eyed collector looked up at Carmine. "You skimmed my collections, Carmine?" Leo asked, his voice deathly quiet. Carmine took another step back, hitting the hood of his own SUV. "Leo, wait!" "You're done, Carmine," Vincent said. Carmine made his last, desperate play. He didn't aim for Vincent. He didn't aim for the captains. He drew his weapon and bolted toward the shadows, sprinting directly toward the concrete pylon where Maeve was parked. He wanted a hostage. He had seen Vincent look in her direction. "Maeve, drive!" Vincent's roar shattered the night. Gunfire erupted, a deafening, chaotic cacophony of cracking metal and splintering glass. Maeve didn't scream. She didn't freeze. The panicked, invisible girl from the basement was gone. Carmine was 10 yards away, raising his gun toward her windshield. Maeve slammed the key in the ignition, dropped the heavy transmission into drive, and stomped the gas pedal flat against the floor. The old sedan roared, the tires screaming against the gravel, kicking up a shower of sparks and rocks. She didn't try to escape. She drove straight at him. Carmine's eyes widened in horror. He fired once, the bullet shattering her passenger side window, spraying her face with glass dust. But the car didn't stop. The heavy steel bumper caught Carmine squarely in the hips. The impact was sickeningly loud. Carmine flipped over the hood, smashing into the windshield, leaving a spiderweb of cracked safety glass, before rolling off the roof and hitting the gravel in a broken, twisted heap. Maeve slammed on the brakes. The car skidded to a halt, the smell of burnt rubber and leaking radiator fluid filling the cabin. Silence returned to the train yard. Maeve sat behind the wheel, her hands gripping the plastic rim so hard her knuckles were white. Her chest heaved. A thin line of blood trickled down her cheek from a tiny glass cut. She stared at the crumpled body of the underboss in her rear-view mirror. Footsteps crunched on the gravel. Vincent appeared at her shattered driver's side window. His gun was drawn, his breathing heavy, his face a mask of pale fury and terror. He looked past her, verifying Carmine wasn't moving, then his eyes snapped to hers. He didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't offer a platitude. He reached through the broken window, his large, calloused hands gripping her face, his thumbs wiping away the glass dust from her cheeks. His touch was desperate, possessing a frantic intensity that grounded her spiraling mind. "You hit him with a car," Vincent breathed, a sound caught halfway between shock and a dark, awe-struck laugh. "I told you," Maeve choked out, her voice trembling, but her gaze locked fiercely on his. "Nobody comes to save the fat girl. I deal with the messes myself." Vincent leaned in, pressing his forehead against hers through the shattered window. The smell of gunpowder, blood, and cold rain surrounded them. "No more," he whispered fiercely. "From now on, I clean the messes." 3 weeks later, the basement archives smelled of nothing. The bleach had finally faded. The fluorescent light still buzzed, but the room was empty. Maeve's cheap metal desk was cleared, the outdated monitor powered down. Maeve stood in the doorway, wearing a tailored wool coat that fit her body perfectly, emphasizing her curves instead of attempting to drape them in shapeless polyester. Her hair was down. The dark circles under her eyes were gone. Footsteps echoed on the metal stairs. Slow, measured, arrogant strides. Vincent walked into the basement. He wore a dark, bespoke suit that hid the bulk of the bandages beneath. He looked whole again, the untouchable phantom of the city. But when he looked at her, the dead, unreadable mask vanished. "The severance package has been wired to the offshore account," Vincent said, stopping 2 feet away from her. His voice was casual, but his eyes were tracking her every movement, searching for a tell. "New passport, new social security number. You can disappear anywhere in the world. You're invisible again." Maeve looked at the empty room where she had spent 3 years hiding from the world, where she had accepted being less. She reached into a designer handbag. She pulled out the heavy manila envelope containing her new identity documents and the banking tokens. She held it out. Vincent didn't take it. His jaw tightened. "What is this?" "I don't want to disappear," Maeve said softly. She stepped forward, closing the distance between them. She wasn't intimidated by his size anymore. She met his gaze evenly. "I spent my whole life trying to take up as little space as possible because I thought if people saw me, they would mock me. or hurt me. Nobody will ever mock you again, Vincent promised. The words a dark, violent vow. I know, Maeve smiled, a small, genuine curving of her lips. Because I'm not hiding anymore. You need a chief financial officer. Someone who knows where the bodies are buried and how the ledgers are cooked. Someone who won't flinch when the room gets messy. Vincent stared at her. The ruthless Mafia Boss, the man who controlled half the city, looked entirely undone by the woman standing in front of him. He reached out, his hand sliding around the nape of her neck, his thumb tracing the pulse, jumping beneath her jaw. The heat of his touch sent a shiver straight to her core. It's a dangerous life, Maeve, he whispered, stepping into her space, his chest brushing against hers. There's no walking away once you're officially in. I hit your underboss with a sedan, Maeve replied, tilting her chin up, refusing to back down from the intensity in his eyes. I think we both know I'm already in. Vincent let out a low rumble of a laugh. He leaned down, his mouth hovering a fraction of an inch above hers. Then let me show you, he murmured against her lips. Exactly what happens when a man finally sees you. He kissed her. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was a collision. A messy, bruising, desperate claiming of a woman who had finally learned how to stand her ground, by a man who would burn the city down to keep her there. Maeve kissed him back, her hands gripping the lapels of his expensive suit, pulling him closer. She took up space, and for the first time in her life, it felt exactly right. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe if you loved Maeve and Vincent's grounded, gritty romance. Their story proves that true strength isn't about fitting the mold, but shattering it completely. What was your favorite moment? Maeve delivering the signet ring, or her handling Carmine with her rusty sedan? Let me know in the comments below. Your support helps bring more complex, deeply human stories to the channel. Hit that notification bell so you never miss out on the next dark romance adventure. Thanks for listening, and see you in the next video.